With Hesiod, we're carrying forward with Greek epic poetry, so we're in the same genre of work that we were in with Homer, but there are some differences also in the way Hesiod approaches this genre, and he puts his own stamp on it, and we want to be attentive to those as we get started. In terms of similarities, we can notice several of them. First of all, what we're talking about is epic poetry. This is a certain kind of genre. It is written in a certain kind of meter. Hesiod has that same dactylic hexameter that Homer used. They also use the same diction. They have this special poetic, epic poetic diction, which draws on dialects from many pieces around the Greek world and is not anything that any particular person would have spoken. When it starts to come out of someone's mouth, you think, well, gosh, they're trying to sound like an epic poet. And it's a specialized kind of language that they both use. The tone that would have been conveyed by this special diction and this dactylic hexameter meter, in both cases would have been very powerful, very moving, and quite grand. In some cases, kind of hypnotic. You have line after line after line of cadences that add up to a kind of otherworldliness to the thing as a whole. They both claim to be inspired by the Muses. Hesiod's inspired by multiple muses, Homer only by one, but both imagine themselves as being a conduit for the muse to speak through them. Also, we've got a potential function for both of them that lines up in an interesting way. Each of these poets, given their collective sense of how the diction works, and given the different kinds of stories they tell, which are drawn from lots of different parts of the Greek world, each of them has probably a functional role to play in helping the Greek city-states to start thinking of themselves as one collective entity. Mostly what we're dealing with when we're talking about ancient Greece is a lot of very disparate city-states. They're at war with one another for centuries before Homer and centuries after. And if one thinks of one's identity, one is first of all a Spartan or an Athenian, but not a Greek. Eventually, though, these pan-Hellenic notions of what a cultural identity is have a little bit more of a greater power over time. Homer and Hesiod are really important in this sense of a kind of communal Greek identity in which all Greek-speaking city-states could share. The other links that make this puts poetry in the same kind of rough cultural role as we see with famous games like that centered at Olympia, and then broader, sometimes very certain kinds of Greek religious festivals bring people together, and there are very prominent oracular shrines that bring lots of different Greeks together. So the poets, the epic poems fit in that kind of a space of providing a potential for a pan-Hellenic identity, overlaid on top of a lot of still city-by-city rivalry. Thirdly, we can look at a similarity in terms of just raw themes. Both of them are interested in gods and heroes. Hesiod a little bit more interested in the gods, Homer more interested in the heroes, but for each of them, this is these two groups, the gods on the one hand, heroes on the other, those are the things that they're most interested in and focus on. There are also differences in these different epics, and I wanted to spend some time just pulling some of those out and highlighting them. There are three that I'll just point out here in formal structure. Also, in addition to these formal differences, there are differences in content where they actually disagree on how the story goes. And then finally, there are differences in overall purpose. And I'll spend some time looking at each of those. In formal structure, Hesiod does not give his story over to the flow of a lovely, elegant, linear narrative story. Homer, I think it's fair enough to say, is a master of narrative. He tells a story, and that's the thing that keeps us linked into his epic poem. Hesiod does not focus on a narrative teleology. There's something else that's pressing his story along, and I'll just point to two things, different kinds of anchoring mechanisms that we see in the unfolding of Hesiod's story. First of all, let's start with lists. Lists are very prominent in Hesiod. They play some role in Homer, and those of you who know the Iliad, we haven't read it for this class, but in Book 2 there's a long catalog of ships, which has a strong place in the tradition, very important, very powerful. Hesiod, the whole epic is kind of peppered with lists. Short lists, long lists, complex lists, more simple lists. And for some of us, as we're reading it, just sitting there on the page, we say to ourselves, my goodness, what am I supposed to make of something like this? And here we have the list of Nereid nymphs, where you've got just all of a sudden 50 proper names. As you're reading along, you say to yourself, how is this advancing the story? It doesn't seem so fascinating. Why would people have celebrated and had 50 proper names listed in their epic? Well, there's a few things I think we can pull out to try to get a fix on this. Number one is something that's completely lost to us on a page, and that's the performative potential built into long lists of proper names. Remember, our poets are doing what they're doing in public for an audience in a performative way from memory. Hard enough to imagine memorizing hundreds and thousands of lines of poetry. Even more hard to imagine memorizing many lines in succession that only have proper names. There's no mnemonic device you can kind of lock into. You can't kind of inhabit the character and remember what comes next in the motivational structure or something like that. Instead, you've just got a long list of proper names. Try memorizing the phone book. It's pretty darn hard. In Hesiod's case, though, obviously he's representing a kind of poetry that shows a performative virtuosity. Watch this oral poet just go and deliver long lists of proper names from perfect memory. He'll do it in perfect cadence according to the metrical constraints of the epic poem, and he'll do it, you can imagine, a kind of drawing in some breath to get through a long list of names, and at the end having to draw in a little bit more, and having people at each go wondering, is this person going to finish this? Is this poet actually going to perform this well? The guy last week only got through 29 of these names. Can this one get through 50? So it would have been very hard. It would have been interesting to watch, and we would have seen rhapsodic poets from memory doing quite amazing things in front of us. That's, of course, entirely lost to us on the page, but it must have been there in the case of Hesiod's performance. Also, these lists remind us that what we're seeing in the form of this ancient epic poetry is something much more than just a great story. We're also seeing a cultural repository. All the stuff that's most important to the culture is going to get contained inside the epic. Sure, stories of the great past, that's important. We definitely see that in Homer. But in Hesiod's case, we have more of a connection to what was surely a really important function in all of ancient epic. That was just a sheer record keeping, memory. You've got to remember the past. Names are important. We can all relate to this. Knowing the names of important people in the past, people who've been lost, people who were killed or who we lost in battle. Keeping track of those names is something that groups of people like to do and cultures like to do. So there's a sense in, I think, these names of Hesiod making sure that we keep track of all of the names of figures that have been around in our past. This is at a time, remember, before there is ample record keeping. Hesiod and Homer are performing during a time when the alphabet is just arriving. Instead, we've got rather clunky lists used before their time with this pictographic script which was not all that efficient. So oral poetry was really a main source of preserving cultural memory, and that had to include lists of specific names. These lists of names are also going to perform a function of bringing disparate groups together. So when one local town has a water nymph nearby them, another local town has a different water nymph, and so on and so on and so on. Well, look, Hesiod's going to string them all together to tell us how they are related and how they are connected. So there's a connecting function that is happening through these lists. May not be apparent to us, but it surely would have been apparent to those that thought one of their nymphs was Thalia and another group that thought their other nymph was Doris. Seeing them in the same list and seeing them genealogically connected would have said, well, maybe I have something in common with you over there. And the feeling could then be mutual. So a sense of making people feel like they have something in common, I think, is also an important aspect of these lists. Then finally, with respect to the list, there's a strong sense of grandeur in an epic. There's a sense of, in these lists, completeness and totality. We've got to get at everything and make sure it's included. Stringing together whole bunches of stuff says, don't worry, everything that's culturally important to remember is going to get in here, and we're just going to make it in. make sure that it gets in. It conveys a sort of encyclopedic aspect to this epic poem, saying it is the most important and most full repository of cultural information you can find. In addition to lists, Hesiod replaces this narrative thrust that drives Homer's epic forward with genealogy. Genealogy, a huge part of Hesiod's story, contained right in his title, as we already saw. It is his main structuring device for how poetry is supposed to work. It organizes the world for him. It surely organizes family trees. That introduces some order into the chaos that's around us. There's no question about that. But there's something, I think, even a little bit more. Hesiod lets that genealogical template expand. It's not just talking about human genealogies and the connections of ancestors. It's talking about the genealogies of all the pieces of the universe. So there's now a genealogical connection between gods and heroes, between abstract forces in the cosmos and themselves, or between those abstract forces and individual divinities. So all things that we see around us now are made to be orderly via this genealogical template. It serves for him as the main way of anchoring all this stuff. And just as a family tree doesn't necessarily have a single narrative to it, so also Hesiod's story is not going to have a single narrative to it. In addition to these formal differences, we looked at Hesiod's lack of narrative teleology. There are also differences in content. We've got, in the case of Hesiod and Homer, different versions of the story. They disagree on things. Hesiod clearly really likes Hecate. Spends a lot of time talking about her. Homer doesn't even know Hecate. He doesn't even mention her. So there's a difference instantly that's obvious just from first reading of the story. We've got different versions of Aphrodite's birth. Hesiod's is this violent, strange one. Homer's is a more kind of normal genealogical connection between Zeus and Dione that brings about Aphrodite. We're going to see differences in the births of the gods. Homer doesn't have a really long, thought-out set of stories about how all the gods come into being. Vaguely, the Homeric gods kind of grow out of the ocean, and then they come from relations that the gods have with each other. Homer doesn't set out to create a kind of grand narrative of where all the gods come from. Very strong contrast with Hesiod. There's a complex genealogical organization to everything. Hesiod makes sure it's all fits in, and especially also the gods. Now finally, in addition to these differences in formal structure and in content, there are also going to be differences in overall purpose. Homer wants to remember great deeds. Hesiod wants to peel back a veil that overlays the secrets of the deep past and tell us about how the world works. Two different approaches, two different purposes in mind. Homer, a preserver of legends of the past, Hesiod, a revealer of hidden truths. And these differences show through in their different temperaments and their ways of approaching their material. Especially when we get to the differences in content, though, we may ask ourselves the question, well, who's right? If Hesiod and Homer disagree, well, what's the true version of the myth? This brings us back to a point that we made in one of our early lectures. Sad to say, there really isn't one single true version of any of these myths. There's not a definitive version that you can always just go to. Instead, there are more or less authoritative versions. What we're going to see in Hesiod is deeply authoritative. It is as deeply authoritative as Homer is. He was well-feted in antiquity. But neither of them can be appealed to as a final story about any of the versions of the story that we're going to see. All we have is more or less authoritative, multiple versions of many of these tales. Sure, we'll run into disagreements between the poets. There are also disagreements that we'll find in local traditions reflected in sort of folk remembering of stories. We'll see it recorded in some of the artistic representations that we've seen behind us at some of the points in our stories. So what we have is a collection of disparate tales woven together, and on occasion we'll have some grand voice that comes along and makes a powerful stamp on the tradition, We'll see it later when we get to Ovid. We've already seen it in the case of Homer, and for our topic this week, we're surely going to see it in the case of Hesiod.